Hi, I'm Jonathan Block. In this video, I'll be making some ambient Mellotron sounds using Stellarvox and a couple of other apps from Igor Vasiliev. The signal chain is the Mellotron M4000D Mini. Its master mono analog output goes into a Universal Audio Volt 276 interface that communicates back and forth with the iPad Pro. I have a setup here in AUM, which I'll bring up here on the screen right now. Again, I'm only using 3 apps from Igor. He's the gentleman that made SpaceFields, which I've used an awful lot, as well as AltaSpace 2, which is another reverb app. I'll primarily be using Stellarvox. This is a reverb app, but it gives you a lot of control over the tails, from the tone, the timbre, the space, the length, the density, etc. But we'll get into that. I want to start with the other apps first, and I'm actually going to start at the end of the chain with an app called VintageRack. And this is meant to give you sounds from early digital effects from the 70s and the 80s. And so you can choose a whole bunch of different ones. I've created a patch here. I'm going to focus more on Stellarvox for this particular video, and none of this is a review. I'm just going to demo a bunch of sounds and just demonstrate how I use these apps. And there's a lot of reviews on YouTube for all 3 of these. I suggest you check them out if you want to go in depth, because I'm not going to kind of go real deep into those. First, let's hear the straight, clean Mellotron sound without any effects. I'll be using primarily the 3 violins, one of the most, if not the most, classic sound from the Mellotron, and that's from the Mellotron Mark II. I'll also be using a number of sounds from the Mellotron M400, including cello, choir, bassoon, oboe, and probably some saxophones as well. So here is the 3 violins with no effects. Let's turn on VintageRack, and again, a lot of capabilities in here. I'm just using this as kind of an end of the chain. I got a compressor going, as well as Dimension D, just to widen the stereo field instead of using something like Spatializer. So let me demonstrate. So the compressor's on, Dimension D's off. Let me turn it on. So you can hear, just widens it a little bit. Very similar to the Boss Wazacraft Dimension D pedal, which I've used and I've done a review on and demo, etc. If I can remember, I will put a link down below. So that is VintageRack. Again, we're going to keep that at the end of the chain. For now, let me just turn that off, and let's go into ClassicFX. So even though this interface is really modern, this is a deep app, and I really have not gotten into it much at all. I found a couple of patches I liked. I tweaked them up, and right now this is a mix of 2 patches that are essentially a grouping of modulation, delay, and reverb. And let me just demonstrate what I've got here. So this is clean. Let's turn it on. So you can hear that. The one thing with this app, and I can't figure it out because I have the output levels on max, I'm sure it's just the nature of the effects. And as you can see, there's kind of sequencing in here too, which is kind of how you get some of that rhythmic feel. All right. Let me add in VintageRack so you can get that compression, end of the chain compression, and a little stereo widening. Again, VintageRack off, so you can hear definitely stereo on the effects, but very much centered. And then we add in VintageRack. It's just the Dimension D. There's an ensemble on here too, which is similar to the Dimension D, but it's not as pronounced. So there we go. All right, let me turn both those off and let's get into Stellarvox here. So again, lots of different controls. I found about 10 patches that I really like. I made those favorites, and then I started tweaking some of them. So this is the one I'm happiest with right now because you get different levels of tail density and time, length, space, the whole 9 yards. So what I'd like to do now is just demonstrate a few of these sounds. I'll start with, let me make sure I've activated this. Yes. So I'll keep VintageRack and the other one off for now. But this is kind of the main sound that I've come up with. Let me just start playing so you can kind of hear what I've got going here. So you can hear it's kind of that, and then it fades out. I call this medium because there's others, and when I start going through these patches, you'll hear some of them get even more dense, and the tail is longer, some are shorter, and so let me just switch through. Whoops, we're going to have to go backwards because that's at the end. So let me start again with that. Oh, the other thing is that because I've done this with SpaceFields and done videos, this is another one of those apps where if there's sound going through and you change the patches, you get some really cool, what I call sounds between the sounds. So you'll hear that as well. So again, this is the patch I've created that I'm going to be using a lot. And I keep going the wrong way. So you hear completely different quality. They're all great. I just kind of picked one out of the bunch and was like, yeah, this sounds good. But a lot of different variations here. I'm not going to go through all of them. And there's way more presets than this. These are just like the 10 I created and I started tweaking. All right, so as you can tell, lots and lots of capabilities with this. Again, back to the sound we'll be using. Let me turn everything else on, because what I'd like to demonstrate now is what I'm going to do here. You can because these tails are so big and so long, you can kind of play some stuff. And then while that's still going in the background, switch over to the next sound in the B slot. Go back to the violins. Change those B slots to choirs. I'm not using the sustain pedal, I'm not using the volume pedal. This is just all Stellarvox. And just kind of flip through some sounds, back to the violins. So you can keep going back and forth, change the choir, and then back to the violins. Oboe. So can keep going on and on like that. But again, really, really, really great app here. Really big space. And one thing I haven't tried yet, but I'm definitely going to do is do Stellarvox into SpaceFields. I think we get some nice, very cool things. But for now, really, really into this. Great way to get, as you can hear, kind of that really wide, complex sound. But, and I should point this out, I only have the wet dry on 45%. So there's only 45% of the wet. And I've mentioned this before in videos. The mix knob is your friend, particularly with instruments like the Mellotron as well as the bass, so you don't lose the sound of that instrument. And that's one of the things, and one of the big differences for me between something like Stellarvox and SpaceFields is that SpaceFields is completely manipulating the sound and almost pulling it apart. So you hear notes occasionally that are drier than others, but in the case of Stellarvox, that's unnecessary because through the mix you can kind of really control the amount of dry sound and that kind of that core sound that's still there. You can hear when it starts getting dense, you're starting to lose that, and a lot of it's smearing, but it's still in there. So that's essentially everything. You've got the setup, the apps, the sounds I'll be using. Let me do the jam. Thanks for watching, thanks for listening, and good luck with your own music.